What is narrative? A narrative is a linguistic representation of an event or a series of events. Most acts involving language, for example, testimonies at a trial, conversations, newspaper articles, history books, text messages, etc., qualify as a narrative. Narratives can be divided into three components: story or fabula, the narrative discourse, and the world of production. Allow me to explain briefly these three components. Component 1, the story, or fabula, as it's sometimes called. The first component of narrative is the story. The story is also occasionally called the fabula, which is the word used by the Russian formalists who first theorized the differences between story and narrative. The story, or fabula, can be defined as the events or actions of a narrative. The story fabula is made up of all the things that happen within the story world, also called the narrative world. The story or fabula can be further divided into three parts: events, entities, and settings. The events are all the things that happen in the story. There are two kinds of events: constitutive and supplementary. Constitutive events are actions or events that absolutely must be there for the story to be itself. In other words, the constitutive events are what define a particular story. Supplementary events, on the other hand, are all other non-essential events and actions in the story. When writing a plot summary at the beginning of your essay, you should always include only the constitutive events of the story. Entities, also called existence, are the characters that appear in the story. In Japanese we say toujou jinbutsu. Entities may be human, animal, or even inanimate objects or abstract ideas. If invested with enough descriptive character traits, a river or city can be considered an entity. For example, in Nagai Kafu's novella Sumidagawa, the Sumida River is described in quasi-human terms. The setting is, of course, where the story takes place. It hosts or contains all of the events and entities of the narrative. It is also occasionally referred to as the story world, or narrative world. Component 2, the narrative discourse. The second component of narrative is the narrative discourse. This is also referred to as suzet, the Russian formalist's term, plot, or mythos. Mythos, of course, is the Greek term that Aristotle used to refer to plot. The narrative discourse can be defined as the actions or events represented linguistically. In other words, it is what the story appears as after it has been rendered into language. Some theorists divide narrative discourse into two groups: style and plot, or suzet. Others claim that style and plot are too interrelated to be neatly separated. Component 3 of narrative is the world of production. This is the third and last component of narrative, the world of production. The world of production refers to everything that goes into producing the narrative. For example, the pens, the brushes, the papers, or if it's a film, the cameras, the sets, even the author or director himself or herself. Laying bare this world of production is a favorite technique of avant-garde or metafiction novelists and cinema verite directors. Two common examples of the world of production being exposed. This technique is sometimes referred to as narrative metalepsis. Two examples of this are when the author herself refers to the act of narrating, or when a film director includes in her film various elements such as cameras or props, grip buoys, equipment, etc., that are used in the making of that film. So these then are the three components of a narrative. We should keep in mind that as readers, we only have direct access to component number 2, the narrative discourse. Our access to component number 1, the story or fabula, is possible only through the mediation of component 2, the narrative discourse. In other words, the story is inaccessible and unknowable, except when it is implotted into a narrative sequence by an author. Another thing to remember is that the story or fabula is open to an infinite possibility of adaptations and renderings, so long as the rendering retains all the essential constitutive events of that particular story. Now that we understand the basic terms of narratology, let us proceed to our first exercise, writing a summary of Kōda Rohan's work, Taidokuro, or the English translation is Encounter with Skull, which is published in 1891, I think, somewhere in the 1890s. Be sure to include in your summary only the constitutive events of the story. Supplementary events, regardless of how anecdotally interesting they may be, should be left out of your summary. They can, of course, be included in the body of your essay, so long as they are relevant to whatever main point you are making. And remember, if it's not causally related to anything else, it's probably not a constitutive event. After you write your summary of Rohan's story, aim for 15 sentences. That could be a bit long, actually, maybe 10 sentences. You can check it against mine, which is as follows. Okay? Now I'm going to read my short summary of all of the constitutive events that appear in Kōda Rohan's Taidokuro. Rohan, a self-assured young man driven by the desire to see as much of the world as he could, goes on a journey through the northern provinces. After losing his way, he comes upon an isolated hut in which a beautiful young woman named Tai lives. Taking pity upon him, the woman invites him in, offers him a hot bath, cleans his clothes, and makes him dinner. She encourages him to stay the night. After eventually agreeing to her request, Rohan proceeds to lie in her bed. After several hours, he realizes that she has given him her only bedding. The two argue over who will sleep on the floor. She surprises him with an invitation to share the bed with her. Rohan considers her offer, but ultimately refuses for fear that he will be overcome by desire. To help ease his mind, he recites the Chinese poem Elimination of Desire, and then asks her to tell him the story of her life. Tai, we learn, was born into a wealthy family. Her father died when she was 14, her mother when she was 18. Before her mother died, she left Tai with instructions never to marry. Despite a very attractive marriage offer from a young nobleman, Tai obeys her mother's wish, and as a result, the rejected nobleman dies of a broken heart. Racked by guilt, Tai follows the young man's dead spirit into the mountains, where she meets a wise priest, who teaches her to live life with a sense of detachment, compassion, and grace. As she finishes her story, the sun begins to rise, and both she and the house vanish. Only a bleached skull remains at Rohan's feet. Upon reaching the neighboring village, Rohan learns that a hideous-looking woman had disappeared into the mountains a year ago, never to be seen again. Now that we understand what a narrative is and what it consists in, we are ready to delve into the texts of this class. As you read through each text, you will want to keep in mind the following 13 sets of questions. I recommend that you refer back to these 13 questions regularly. And I posted the Japanese version of this, Japanese explanation of these 13 points, 13 questions, onto YouTube a few days ago. And now I will read them in English and explain them. 13 things to consider when reading narrative. Number 1. Who is the narrator? For example, first person, third person, neither. Number 2. Is the narrator a reliable narrator or an unreliable narrator? Can we trust what he or she says, or it says? Or is he, she, it trying to justify or vindicate him or herself to his, her readers, the world, in some way? For example, in Moriogai's Vita Sexualis. Number 3. If the point of view is third person, is that third person narrator omniscient? Limited omniscient? Where is the focalization point? And again, focalization point, or shoten in Japanese, is just the point where the third person narrator fixes itself. For example, there might be 10 characters in a story, in a third person story, but the third person narrator chooses to enter the hearts and minds of only 2 of those 10 characters. And in that case, you say the focalization point is on characters A and B rather than the other 8. So where is the focalization point in the third person narrative? Number 4, does the narrator primarily show via mimesis or dialogue or free indirect discourse or interior monologue, etc.? Or does the narrator primarily tell via narration, description, direct description from the narrator's own perspective, etc.? How does the preferred narrative strategy affect the presentation of the story and the arrangement of plot? An example to consider is a story that we're reading for this class, Akutagawa's Yabu no Naka, in a grove, which is all show and no tell. So what does Akutagawa achieve by employing the method of show entirely and by avoiding the method of direct narrative discourse or tell? Number 5, what is the relationship between the narrator and the events or characters that he or she describes? How close are they emotionally, temporally, spatially? Is there any ironic distance between the narrator and the described story? Is dramatic irony created? If it is a first-person narrator, is there an epistemological gap between the narrator at present and his or her past self? For example, has the narrator come to know things through the process of the story that he or she did not know in the past, which he is or she is now describing? Number 6, always keep in mind the era or historical context and literary context in which a work was written. Is the work a reaction or a response to certain events or forces of history, or to certain literary trends of the time? For example, Morioga's Vita Sexualis, which I mentioned a minute ago, is sort of a response to the literary discourse or literary style of naturalism, Shizen Shugi, which was ascendant at the time. Number 7, consider the style of the work. And usually you will, in the case of Japanese literature, you won't be able to do this just by looking at the translation, unless the translation is exceptional. You will have to read the original, of course. Is the style more literary, poetic, metaphoric, symbolic, and figurative? Or is it more directly representational, realistic, transparent? In short, is it closer to poetry, or is it closer to a newspaper article? Those are the 2 opposite poles, and so where does this particular work fall on that axis? Number 8, what sort of symbols or images or metaphors or extended metaphors are found in the work? What is their effect? Do these images, metaphors, symbols carry specific meanings that are culturally prescribed, or are they generally universal? And you should note that in general, the more recent the work is, the more universal these symbols and metaphors are, with the influence of globalization and all that. Number 9. 9 is a simple point to always make a clear distinction between the author and the narrator. They are generally separate. Even if there's overlap between the two, we should read them and treat them separately when we write our essays. So we don't want to fall into the trap of reading a work in the purely autobiographical mode of reading, which equates narrator and author completely. Narrator and author are not the same, even in cases where there is biographical overlap, such as in the example I keep citing, Moriogai's Vita Sexualis. Number 10. Note the implied relationship between the narrator and the reader or audience. Does the narrator address a specific audience? Is he or she confiding in this implied reader, or trying to convince the reader of something? How does the presence of this implied reader affect the narrator's behavior or narrative? And you will want to note that an implied reader or audience often makes the narrator more conscious of his act of narration, as seen in the self-conscious narrators of early and pre-modern Japanese fiction. Also in modern fiction we see Akutagawa's Negi, the short story Green Onions, for example, or in Dazai Osamu's fiction, or in Ishikawa Jun's metafiction, and much contemporary fiction, where the implied presence of a reader or an author makes the narrator acutely aware of this act of narration. Number 11. Always note the forms or the genre of the work. For example, Bildungsroman, a Künstlerroman, a confession, a quest story, a picaresque novel, a dream narrative, a prose poem, a ghost story, or a traditional ghost story in the case of early modern Japanese literature is called the Hyaku Monogatari. Nikki Bungaku, the diary literature, Monogatari form, Uta Monogatari, Setsuwa. I could go on and on with the list of forms and genres that exist both in the West and in East Asian literature. And how is the content of the work shaped by the form or genre in which it appears? How is the form affected, changed, altered by the content it contains? And keep in mind that it's often the case that authors are aware of these various genres and employ elements from several genres in one story. So a single story might be 2 or 3, or a combination of 2 or 3 forms or genres. Number 12. This is the question of desire. How is desire depicted in the work? Who desires what? What is the nature of that desire? How are desire and narrative related? So desire and the act of narration, how are these related? Note that criticism that focuses on these questions usually falls under the category of psychoanalytic criticism. So people use the methods of Freud and Lacan and whatnot to discuss how desire functions in the text. And you could also sometimes, Buddhism becomes relevant here too, because Buddhism is sort of a science of desire and how desire functions in humans. So in the case of East Asian literature, the questions of desire and sort of Buddhist thought are often interrelated. Number 13, do the characters correspond to certain archetypes? So this is the question of archetypes, or genkei in Japanese. Are these character types particular? For example, limited to a certain nation? Or are they universal? Or are they a combination of the two? For example, Bochan, I think, by Natsume Soseki, is a combination of the two. Bochan is a sort of archetypal edoko, which is an archetype limited to Japan. However, he's also recognizable to non-Japanese readers who know nothing about Edo and edokos and sort of Edo culture. And he's recognizable as a kind of universal archetype as well. Okay, so these are the 13 questions. You want to consider all of these every time you watch a movie, every time you read a short story, every time you read a novel, and so forth. If you have any questions, send me a mail about these. That is all.